Hey, thanks for joining us for another of your favorite Nordic CEO stories, brought to you by the She community. I'm your host, Matt C. Smith, and this morning, in this episode, we've got a leader who's joining me who's got quite an interesting background. He's got a major disagreement with Steve Jobs and has spent the majority of his 11 years now trying to bring skateboarding into the corporate boardroom. Yeah. Mats Johansson is the CEO of Aker Biomarine, the world's leading supplier of krill. If you don't know what krill is, I Googled it myself too. It's basically whale food, but I think Mats can give us a little bit more detail about that as we go. And they get that from the waters of the Antarctic. And now he spends his days helping fishermen get into business. Mats, welcome to the show, mate. First question, as always, and I think I'm going to do a hybrid of the question today. Do you eat krill for breakfast?
Yeah, actually, I take my krill at night. So for breakfast, I don't have krill, but I take a krill supplement every night.
All right, so fill us in. What is krill?
So krill it's actually the biggest biomass on the planet. So there's more on this planet than krill. Twice the size of the human biomass. It's an untapped resource. It's everywhere in all the ocean, but it's only in Antarctica where they come together in these big schools so you can catch them. And then they sit in the bottom of the food chain. And we know from biology that all important molecules and nutrients, they accumulate up through that food chain. So you can imagine that through millions of years of evolution, krill and the molecules and nutrients in krill have become important for all life on the planet. That's our business idea. So here's an untapped potential with some nutrients that probably is going to be important for humans and animals. And basically, we're the first company that can build technology to harvest this in a sustainable way. We refine out the molecules. We do a lot of research to understand how it impacts the life of people and animals, and then we commercialize what we find.
Wow, I think David Attenborough would be proud of that one. So we're learning things. I wonder if you actually listening to this or watching this right now knew about that. I've heard about your company, and I'm quite interested to know. We'll talk a little more about it in a moment about sort of how you guys have sort of created eco harvesting, because the oceans are depleting when we come to fishing. It's a touchy topic. Norway and the Nordics in general have been long harvesters of the oceans, and now recently harvesters in an economic way, right, in a sustainable way. But we'll get to that in a moment. I want to talk less about you, less about krill, and more about you, Mats. So, brief history. Mats, born in Sweden, grew up in Kragerø, which, for those of you who haven't heard of that, it's a couple hours south of Oslo. It's a holiday town, right? It's sort of the Hamptons of Oslo. Would you call it that?
Yeah, so it's like 5,000 people in the winter and 40,000 in the summer.
There you go.
So it's quite a good place to grow up, right? Because it's kind of quiet and calm during the winter, and then there's a lot of action, between May and, let's say, in September. So you have always something to look forward to. So it's a good place to grow up.
I've been there. It's a wonderful place. If you haven't been, check it out. I feel like I'm promoting tourism for Norway right now. It's not a bad podcast to do that. But you spent your youth doing something quite unique, right? You decided to forego education in your journey towards leadership. And you started your first part of your career skateboarding and snowboarding, actually becoming a career. So I actually want to ask you a question. Can you build a career from that? And can you live from it, skateboarding?
Yeah, today you can. But in the 90s, you could not. So, and that's how I got into business, because I got broke.
So what was your first job?
So I took probably the lowest, shittiest job, possible. So I started all the way on the kind of bottom part. I did, telesales. I was packaging these kind of mailings with advertising that went to businesses. I was putting stuff in envelopes. I started really at the bottom and worked my way up from there.
Yeah. So it started from the bottom, no clear path towards that. Leading, a company of 500 people today, fishermen, marine biologists and things like that, right? It's a far cry from where you started, right? When you were that age, there's some question I always like to ask CEOs of some stature. Did they ever have a break? Because, we often have this feeling that sometimes one opportunity is the one opportunity that brings all the rest. Did you ever have a break?
Yeah, I think I had a couple of breaks. It's a chain of coincidences, that kind of brought me forward. So, just, starting with skateboarding. For me now in business, we'll talk more about that later, but that's kind of my fundament of my beliefs. And I think also part of my success is kind of that experience that I have from that. And then I met some important people along the way that, helped me kind of put me in the right direction. And then I did a lot of hard work myself.
So take me back to those early days in Kragerø. Skateboarder wants to go pro, but unfortunately it's still too early. There's no income in it for you. So you started from the bottom. You joined. What company were you working with at the beginning, straight after that?
Yeah, so basically, I mean, I went to high school. I was good in math. You know, you go to the advisors at school, they kind of tell you, okay, you should study this. So they suggested I should be an auditor. And today we can laugh about that because that's the furthest away from who I am. But anyway, that's the advice I got. And I applied for school for that in Oslo. So I moved into Oslo to start education to become an auditor. And it took me like 3 months. I figured out that was not for me. And at the same time, you know, growing up in Kragerø, we were like 2-3 guys skateboarding, right? Came to Oslo, there was like hundreds. You know, daytime, nighttime, there was always someone you could go skate with. So it took me just a couple of months, dropped out of school. You know, started skateboarding. You know, the ski slope here in Oslo is open till 10 o'clock every night, you know, so you can snowboard
and it's
every day.
Flood-lit. Yeah. It's flood-lit. There's lights. If you haven't been there, I urge you to. It's good fun.
So, but then, you know, eventually I got broke. You know, no more money. I had my loan from the student loan, you know, that I was living off. And that eventually that went you know, out. And I had to just get a job and get some money. And then, so it was not like a clear path for me at that time. It just happened. I just followed my passion and what I wanted to do. I needed to get a job. I got in there, and then I saw that I kind of enjoyed working. And I enjoyed, you know, I mean, for me at that time, it was about kind of being the flexible guy, you know, the guy that kind of always said yes for that extra shift or that extra work. And that was kind of the start of my career.
But that's an interesting starting point then, you know, you being flexible and always saying, I mean, is that also always saying yes? Is that what flexibility is? Is that just always being available?
So I think especially when you're young, or if you have like a disadvantage, you know, versus your competition in business, you know, I think your number one kind of value is, especially when you're young, is your ability to work long hours and be flexible. You know, when you get older, you get kids, you get family commitments, you can't do that anymore. But when you're young, that's your number one asset you bring to the table. So I try to advise all the young people I meet out there that that's your number one asset. Use that wisely during those years in the 20s, because when you're 30, 40, it's not so easy to be flexible and work long hours anymore.
That's a good point. I mean, I want to challenge you on that too, because working long hours and you know, we've gone through a bit of a transition. And, you know, I think in the 80s, 90s and thousands, you know, it was work hard, eat or be eaten, right? Now we're living in a world where mindfulness obviously is a strong, integral part of the healthiness around work, right? So I think, you know, that rhetoric, that very kind of New York, London rat race rhetoric of work hard, work hard, work hard. Did you find something that helped you work hard, that kept you grounded, that kept you sane? Is there some hack that we should know about? Do you meditate, or is it skateboarding? Is skateboarding what kept you sane?
I mean, it was actually a point where I could have a hobby where I could completely kind of zone out. So when you do skateboarding, you're very focused on what you do. So you're not thinking about work or anything else. So I think that helped me, gave me like kind of possibility to kind of just zoom out for a short period of time. But I think also it's all about kind of finding a work that you feel passionate about, you know, do something that you enjoy and that you feel that you work with friends. And so it's not kind of you're working hard because a boss is pushing you. You're actually working hard because you want to. And I think that's a big difference, you know. So you need to find that place, you know, that company, those colleagues where you actually enjoy spending time with them. And then it doesn't become a problem. But I think it's harder now than it was in the 90s when I started, because, I mean, you say mindfulness and, you know, need to be nature and need to be in friends. I think all of these things are expectations that's been created, you know, from externally. So it's not enough anymore just to kind of work hard and kind of be at work. You also need to show that you're kind of training in good shape. You need to cook your dinners from scratch. You need to be out in nature. I mean, there's so many expectations of who you need to be. So it's much harder to kind of make that choice to say, I'm going to sacrifice all that and I'm going to spend my early years to kind of build competence and experiences that's going to build my career long term.
I think that's something we all watching and listening to this can relate to, right? You know, we're meant to meditate, we're meant to eat vegan, we're meant to exercise daily, weekly, you know. It's overwhelming. I mean, I'm always trying to be a better person. I know we all are trying to be a better person, but sometimes, you know, Jesus, you have to take a step back and just be. It's okay to watch Netflix for one night and binge watch it or whatever. It's okay to eat a whole bar of chocolate every now and then, right? I think anything in moderation, right? But there's a question then, you know, you sound like you've learned some lessons with that. How would you describe yourself as a person through those early years before you really got into those large leadership roles? Because they've obviously shaped you as an individual.
Yeah, I think I've been like a positive guy, like an optimist, you know, and I think that's kind of something that's been driving me my whole life. And just kind of a more sadder example of that. I mean, my mother got cancer, eventually died of it, but I thought, you know, we could cure her all the way to the bitter end. So that's just kind of deep in my personality. That I'm looking at the opportunities. I'm always focused on there's a way out. There's you know, there's a positive spin to everything that you do. So that helped me a lot, kind of through, you know, challenging parts of life and my career. So I think that's kind of one part of it. And then also I'm a good risk taker. You know, and you have to get out of your comfort zone, you know, and do things that feels a little bit uncomfortable. And that's I think one of the number one things I have from skateboarding. Because skateboarding, it's all about managing risks. Because it's about evolving yourself as a skateboarder and be able to do tricks you couldn't do in the past. And the only way to do that is you need to try some things that you were not able to master before. And then you're using, I mean, the capital that you put into play in that risk is your own body. So you're finding the perfect risk of pushing the borders. You can make that progress, but at the same time, make sure you don't die or break your arm, you know, because that's gonna put a quick stop to things. So I think these two things is kind of deep in my personality.
Because that reminds me again of your disagreement with Steve Jobs, right? I mean, it's human nature to say no, right? But you said something interesting to me the other day that, you know, we value losing twice as high as we do the gaining something. So I think metaphorically speaking, to you listening to this, if you were to find $10 on the street, you know, you'd be like, oh, that's great. But if you were to lose $10 on the street, you would value the loss twice as hard as you would the gain. Is that correct, right? So saying yes to things, having a positive spin, and actually maybe that's another metaphor there around falling off your skateboard, getting up again and trying the trick again, right? Until you get it.
Absolutely. And that's like you say, I mean, Steve Jobs, he used to say that innovation is about saying no to 1,000 things. And my theory is that Steve Jobs said that because he didn't want anybody to kind of tamper with his idea of what the iPhone should look like, right? So that's why he said that. I think probably he also knew about risks and the importance of that, but that's what he said. But I mean, my disagreement on that is that, as you say, I mean, it's human nature to say no. You know, probably from when we were cavemen, right? If you lost the food for a day, we could die. If you found some extra food, you know, I mean, you didn't have a fridge to put it in, so I mean, so there was no value out of it. So I think as leaders, as managers, we play a very important role to help our organization take more risks. Because if you don't help them to do that, they won't take risks. They will choose the safe path, and then you don't have progress. And especially in these times where things are changing so fast, if you don't have that progress, you're going to eventually die.
So tell me, how does an uneducated former skateboarder end up leading a 500 fisherman, you know, company with 500 employees, $250 million in revenue, with PhD marine biologists? I spoke about that break. I mean, but how did you get into that role? Was it a case of just knocking on the front door and saying, "Hey, I'm here and I want to help"? How did you do it? How did you break in?
So it started with me. I mean, it started with me getting broke and getting that first job. And I started working, even if I did a shitty job, I worked for a quite big company. It's a company called Paintbox back then. It was owned by the biggest advertising agencies in Norway. So it was kind of an interesting company, so to speak. So I was focused getting in there, first make a living, you know, get some money in my hand. And then I saw, okay, I'm getting something back of working hard and being the flexible guy. And, you know, for me, that's just started with, you know, if someone asked me for an extra shift, I always said yes. You know, if I need to finish a job, I stay 2 more hours, you know, whatever I had to do. And then eventually, these type of people, and I see it in my own organization, these type of people that always are flexible and willing to work, eventually will get an opportunity. You know, there's a manager that's sick or someone is suddenly leaving, they'll ask you. And that's what happened to me back then. So kind of starting to make the first kind of small moves, and then a coincidence, you could say, because basically one of the clients that I was working with in that company went bankrupt. And because of that, I got kind of exposure to the CEO of the company. And then he saw something in me, where here's a young guy willing to work hard. And he was a hard worker himself. He was the type of guy that would call in for a meeting 5 o'clock in the morning. And then we're going to have a follow-up, meeting at 11 o'clock at night. And he saw that here's a guy that's going to be useful for me, that can really, I can sit with him in the morning. He can go do all the work through the whole day. I'm gonna meet with him at 11 o'clock at night. And there's no.
But what drives you to do that? Because I mean, I'm a hard worker. I like to work, but there's a boundary, right? I mean, what's your advice to someone who's pre-30, pre-40? I mean, is your advice have no boundaries, put in the work, and then reap the rewards at your age now when you're in your mid-40s?
Yeah, it depends on what you want to do with your life, right? For me, kind of career and being successful is important. And if that is important for you, I think you have to make that investment. Or you have to be so much more brilliant, than everybody else that you're going to beat them on that. But for most of us, we're not that brilliant. We just have to work hard. So for me, that was kind of something I wanted to do. And I think also, I mean, it's all about choosing. I mean, they say that, always kind of when you give advice to students and young people, I mean, it's about finding that company where you enjoy working, that you enjoy the colleagues. And this was then, in the 90s, some of those people I worked back then, they're still my friends. So even if I spend a lot of time at work, I was spending time with friends, around work. And I think that's followed me, and it's maybe a little bit sad, but if you kind of look at where my friends is coming from, they're all coming from work, throughout my career, because I don't have time to make friends outside work. So
I don't think that's sad at all, because I read a beautiful comment once, which basically analogizes or shows you that in the first 20 years of your life, you spend the most amount of time with your parents that you will throughout your entire life, right? After the first 20 years, you spend very little time with your parents, and therefore family after 32, because the most amount of time you spend during your entire life is your work colleagues between the ages of sort of 20 to 50 or so, right? So you have a 30-year period where you actually spend the most amount of time, even if it's just business interactions, with those individuals. So I think it's so important to live and love what you do and enjoy the people around you, because they're the people you spend your life with. What do you do at Arca now? This is a slight tangent, but we're living in a world of COVID right now. Offices are obviously reducing their working hours or core working hours. Are you doing anything that helps your employees maintain that camaraderie and that friendship?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a very good point, because of that kind of experience that I made myself, in which of enjoying your colleagues, their company. I've been very focused on that in Aker BioMarine, to have it as a fun place to work. You need to have humor in what you do. Not take yourself too serious, and you need to do fun stuff. And we do that, always. And that's challenging now when everybody's home, right? So I mean, how do you do that? And especially when you're a company where your culture is kind of built on that kind of inspiration, engagement, creativity, and all that stuff, and then you can't meet each other anymore. So, I mean, I think we're kind of early days in exploring how that can work. But I mean, like on Fridays, we have quizzes with all our employees, with prizes, and everybody can talk and have a beer in their homes and kind of gather like that. We use Workplace, from Facebook, where everybody's sharing from what they're doing, what they're achieving, and commenting, and kind of having that social network. So you can kind of get that digital variant of your colleagues around with fun comments on their, what you do and stuff like that. But it's hard, I would say. I mean, to compensate for that kind of physical world that we don't have anymore.
So I want to jump back to Aker BioMarine, right? So you've been there for 11 years. You're the CEO at the moment. You've been building that organization, listed on the Norwegian Stock Exchange. You're a skateboarder with no education. Do you ever have any imposter syndrome issues?
Yeah. But probably not because of my background, but I think like all, if everybody's honest, everybody in my role, they're thinking, okay, when are they going to discover that I'm not knowing what I'm doing, right? Because, and that's about, taking this risk, venturing into things, not having the solution for everything you do. So I always kind of, or often think about that. Okay, shit, I'm over my head. I have way too big responsibility. It's been that through my whole career. But I think that's what makes it exciting, and I think that's what's been evolving me. Getting myself out of that kind of comfort zone to push kind of forward. And I would say, as a person also, and part of my success is that I would rate myself as an insecure overachiever. And I think that's part of the success. So I'm not kind of like an arrogant douchebag. I'm an insecure guy that never is satisfied.
Insecure overachiever. So break that down for me. So obviously insecure being you, obviously, like you said, you can't believe sometimes that they're going to figure it out at some point. It's been 11 years now. At any moment now, they're going to go, hold on a minute. You're a fraud. You're a fake. You don't know what you're doing, right? So that's the insecure element. And the overachiever, obviously, because you're in that role, actually achieving and you're still there and they haven't figured it out yet.
But that's the reaction to that insecurity, right? So that's that overachievement is the reaction to that insecurity. And you can look at the opposite. If you're secure and arrogant, then you start to take things easy. You don't do it properly. You're just I'm gonna serve for my kind of experience on this. I'm not gonna kind of bother to kind of go deep and check the details and things like that. So I think it's a trap, to be too confident. I think insecurity it's good.
How do you keep yourself humble then? Because leaders, we speak to so many on this show, and obviously they're a mixed bunch of very hyper confident, extroverted individuals who you come across as an extremely confident individual, well spoken, conviction in what you say. So how do you stay humble?
So actually, in that first job I had, when I met that CEO, I mean, he later became my mentor, and we're still meeting regularly. And he kind of gave me one advice, back then when I was like 22, which I followed, ever since. And he said that you need to be, let's say the English word for it, you need to be humble but determined.
Humble but determined. What's the Norwegian word?
Ydmyk men bestemt.
Ydmyk men bestemt.
Yeah. So that means
apologies for the poor Norwegian.
So that means that very good Norwegian. So that means you need to know what you want. And I think as a leader, your organization demands that from you. Direction. I know what I want. Being determined on that. But at the same time, you need to be humble with that approach and listen, to what people have to say, to the negative forces. And I think especially in academia, we are adopting that to our business too. I mean, I'm sure a lot of the listening here, when you talked about krill and Antarctica and whale food, a lot of people thought, okay, you're taking the food from the whales, and you should stop doing that stuff. And a lot of people think like that. So take Greenpeace as an organization. They've been thinking like that, and they've been campaigning against us early. And typical reaction from a corporation there is kind of go into war. They don't have the facts, they don't understand. We are the ones understanding, and kind of you go and fight that. We didn't do that. We listened to them. And we heard, okay, what are you worried about? And they said, we're worried about some penguin colonies on these islands where, the climate change is threatening their habitat. So we don't want, fishing activity around that. And we said, that makes sense. So we're going to voluntarily, even if regulatory you are able to do it, we're going to stay out of those areas. So I think that's a good example of, even if we know what we're doing in Antarctica is right, it is the most sustainable fishery in the world. It's important to not become arrogant and always listen to those people when you're kind of determined on your path forward.
So it sounds like you approach leadership and leading an organization and what you're doing very non-confrontal, what's the word? Confrontational. That's the word.
Yeah.
You're listening to what everyone has to say. Is that something you also take into the internal organization as well?
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, another trait of my personality is that I don't like conflicts. I'm shy of conflicts, so it's kind of natural for me also to try to steer away from that, right? So in my personality, but it's the same thing. I mean, we have as part of our culture with that design, we cheer each other on as kind of a key fundament in our organization, of kind of creating that positive vibe and supporting each other in the organization.
So coming back to Aker BioMarine and your role as a leader in that, because I mean, we've had Isabel Alverberg here, who is the CEO of Snøhetta. Now, she isn't an architect, yet she runs an architectural company, right? You're not a fisherman either, and you're basically managing those individuals in the Antarctic. How do you manage so many fishermen? I mean, is it a very different leadership style you have to have versus people sitting in an office on desks and computers?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, yes and no. I mean, there's very different people, you know. So I mean, and as you said, I mean, one part of our organization is the fishermen, but we have a quite big R&D organization, like you said. I mean, we like 17 people with PhDs, you know, double PhDs in biology and chemistry and all type of stuff. We have ex- McKinsey consultants that work in business development, salespeople all around the world. We have factory in Houston, Texas. So we have all this kind of diverse pot of different people of different backgrounds. Some with a lot of education, some with none. And I think that what makes it challenging as a leader, but it's also very kind of I would say valuable. I mean, both for me and for the organization to have all these different angles and inputs on the challenges and the stuff we do. So for us, kind of the leadership style is more the culture, right? So that culture that binds us together. So if you're a fisherman or if you're a researcher or an ex-McKinsey guy, is that same culture, that attitude, behavior in the bottom. That's kind of what unites us. And then we have different competence and different approaches to it. And then if you get that to work well, there's some really great things that comes out of it.
And that's a running trend we hear from all our CEOs about how important building a culture is in your organization. And obviously a way that you're doing that is by making people friends, colleagues of friends. I've personally had experience of working with people who I adore as friends outside and inside the office. And I was willing to go the extra mile at any time for either of them, just not even for the company, but for each other. And I think that's when you have a beautiful organization. Again, everyone listening to this right now, we've heard a few interesting thoughts from CEOs over these podcasts. And what a real running trend is that by creating camaraderie and this accountability amongst friends, people are working for each other. The company is just the roof over their heads that hopefully has a mission that they agree with, right? But they work collectively towards that vision, and therefore the company excels. And we know how important that is today, especially when no one is now obviously working together in the same room, right? Hopefully you've had a legacy of friendship that gets carried into this COVID environment. So that's a nice little transition into equality and diversity. Like you said, you have all kinds of people working in the company, from double PhDs to fishermen and maybe fisher women. I don't know. Your industry must be quite male dominated, right?
Yeah, it's quite male dominated, actually.
But there's an interesting question. Are you trying to bring women into that industry? Should you? I mean, what's your approach?
Yeah, so actually we have just hired a new fishmate. So a fishmate is a second in command on a vessel. Runs all the fishing operation, all the navigation of the vessel. So it's kind of second in command on the vessel. And we just hired now a female fishmate. And there's very, very few of them. I think you can count them on less than a hand in Norway. But I think it's, as you say, it's kind of very male-dominated environment in fisheries. And women, they bring a lot of qualities into management and leadership. So it's a pity that industry is not able to kind of gain the benefits of that. So that's why it's so great that we've been able to kind of hire and recruit this type of, female leaders into our fishing fleet. And she already started, and she's been welcomed from all guys, and they respect her. And I expect great things from the dynamics that we're going to create in the leadership around fishery when you have a female leader on the fishing boat.
What does equality mean to you, Mats?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at the definition of equality, it's about everybody getting the opportunity to get their full potential out of their life and their talent. And so that's a definition of equality. And if you look at the definition for, let's say, the people in Aker BioMarine, what we are kind of talking about when it comes to people is about we want to recruit the best talents out there, and we want to make sure that we can develop and get the most out of the potential that sits in that talent. So it's actually quite goes well together. I mean, so this whole there's no kind of the equality challenge. There's no business conflict related to that. So for me, it's all about getting out the full potential there is there. If you're female, if you're a different culture background, you're a skateboarder, or you have double PhD, you all bring a potential into our company. And for me, it's all about getting all those different talents and potential into our company to create value for our company, basically.
How do you get someone's, we all hear that sometimes someone is picked out by a teacher or a senior, a manager, like, you got talent, kid, you got talent. How do you foster someone's talents to come out?
Yeah, I mean, managers plays a very, very important role. I mean, you're the one you're reporting to, and that's something we try to train all our managers on how you have these kind of talks, how you identify the talents, understand where they want, where is their passion, and how to drive them. So twice a year we have a talk with all our employees. And go through what are the kind of focus areas where we're going to develop you into kind of the next level. So I think the key sits here in middle management to identify that talent and help them bring that forward.
Because you're obviously doing something right, if you're bringing in, these fish mates, if you're bringing women into an industry that has, predominantly been heavily dominated by men, right? So I'm asking all our CEOs this because, this podcast is also, as well as you listening to this, you might be a CEO yourself, but there are CEOs listening to this. What advice would you, Mats Johansson, CEO of Aker BioMarine, give to other CEOs out there about how to include equality and diversity in the workplace?
So I think if you look at most CEOs out there, they're old, and me included. I'm past my 40s, so I'm also now getting into the old category. And the challenge when you get old is that you start to be, what to call it, like you don't want to take risks. You don't want to step out your comfort zone. You start to kind of be very focused, and your square is getting narrower and narrower. So kind of my big tip to all the CEOs out there is that you need to challenge yourself and have someone around you that kind of have the, let's say, younger voice of things, because that's how you can evolve. And I think a lot of these challenges that we have with equality of gender equality sits in that, because basically the potential of the female. Look at the schools now. All the best performing students now are female. So I don't understand why there's, not more female leaders out there. And I think it is because everybody, the old leaders are stuck in their comfort zone. I want to work with the guys that I'm used to work with. It's kind of more comfortable with me to work with a man than, a female colleague. So I think people are just stuck in that comfort zone. That's kind of my main advice, to try to, and to do that, you can try to tell yourself to kind of look at the comfort zone. It's not going to help. You need someone. So I'm focusing my leadership group to have young people, ideally below 30. Now they're growing up, but I have kind of early 30s. I have in my leadership group young people that can challenge us older guys, to not get stuck in our comfort zone.
Well, then, if you're listening to this and you're in those younger 30s or late 20s and you want to work with your CEO, maybe you should share this podcast with them. They can be a bit inspired and who knows, maybe add you to the leadership team. I know that there is a great initiative where they have CEO for a day. Have you heard about this? CEO for a day, where they have someone who is, under the age of 18 or 16 or whatever, and they become the CEO of a company for a day. I think it's every single October or something like that, a yearly thing. And it just brings some interesting and fresh insight because, talking about diversity and leadership, right? You can only lead with a diverse outlook if you have diversity in opinion. Therefore, bringing different people and giving them a voice at the table ultimately allows you to engineer the direction of that organization towards equality and diversity, right?
Yeah. And I would say just a tip there for all the kind of the normal workers out there, because when these things happen, when you bring these young people, you take risk and you bring these young people forward, I think it's very important that the colleagues is supporting that. And especially, I think here in Norway, we have the famous Jante law that you might be, no one should kind of stick out and be any different than anybody else. And I think it's quite challenging to be young and kind of have a good career, because there's a lot of envy around. So I think also, so one thing is a tip to the managers, or the leaders out there, but I think there's a tip to the colleagues too. So even if you yourself would like to kind of get that kind of management role, support that colleague of yours and make it easy to come up and stick your head out and be a little bit different and challenge things.
That's really well said, Mats. I'm going to ask you my final question. I know everyone wants to know this, and this is going full circle back to the gentleman who started out in Kragerø, moved to Oslo, skateboarder, snowboarder, worked in different industries, all the way up to now being the CEO of Aker BioMarine. Do you still skateboard to work?
Not to work, but and that's not practically. But I still skateboard. Not because of COVID. It's the skateboard, places are closed. But normally I skate at least once a week.
At least once a week. Okay, good. Because that's your therapy. That's your element. And now, as always, as you all know, I love to sum things up at the end of this. So I made a few notes. I'm going to read through those one by one. So number one, one of my main takeaways from this is being flexible, willing to work. You get offered the opportunity. So I think there's a metaphor there about just being available and always being seen as, you don't have to work all day, every day, all weekend, every weekend, but just being flexible and willing, saying yes to support people around you, whether they be your colleagues or your leaders. Having a hobby, right? To zone out. I think that's what, to you, Mats, your skateboarding was, right? So, I'm always looking for these secret hacks to leadership, these secret hacks to succeeding today. And to be honest, the bottom line is there really isn't one. Just having some hobby that takes you out of your working environment, at least once a day or once a week. Some people it's meditation, some people it's skiing, if you have that available to you. In your case, skateboarding again. So strong skateboarding sales tactic here, I think, for you, Mats. Maybe we should go into skateboarding business. Trying to put a positive spin on things. I know this is easier said than done. Some people are a little bit more glass half full or half empty, but trying to angle and having a positive outlook is so important today, especially the world we live in with COVID, right? So I know many of you listening and watching to this are struggling. I am. We all are struggling in our own ways. So having empathy for others right now is a very important trait to have. Being broke was a blessing for you, Mats, it sounds like.
Yeah.
It sounds like that was a blessing because a lot of people are terrified of that. And I've been broke. We've all been broke at some point in our lives. Obviously, we live in the Western world, so being broke to us is not quite what broke is to someone else. But having that feeling of not having everything and anything that you want right now and then can be a blessing, using it to gain what you want in the long term. Have humor in what you do. Now, this is, again, on your way you lead and way you manage your company. Having humor in what you do. I think that's a really good tactic. And having a mentor. Again, this is a running thread again, that I think if you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, it's never too late, by the way. So finding someone that you've identified, whether it's preferably someone not necessarily in your closest network, someone who's on that second tier network, an acquaintance who you admire in the industry, build a rapport with, and sometimes people are quite flattered when they ask to be mentors. So I urge you, if you're listening to this and you're thinking about mentorship, I know Mats is a mentor for the She community through the She Mentor Network. Find someone, identify someone, build a relationship with them. Don't just go blustering in immediately and asking for them to be your mentor. Maybe Mats will be your mentor. Mats, will you be my mentor?
Sure.
I think that's a great way to finish. Mats Johansen, CEO of Akerbaro, thank you so much for joining us on Breakfast with the CEO. And go ahead and listen to one of the other podcasts, if you don't mind, Mats. I think there's some interesting ones in there. Maybe you can learn something, Mats.
Definitely, I will.
Awesome. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for listening, everyone. And as always, take care.